Hello. I want to talk about one of my favourite chapters in the Old Testament, Isaiah 40. And I want to start by putting it into context so that we have a greater understanding of what is happening in this chapter. Before we get to Isaiah 40, some very interesting events unfolding, which we read about in the later chapters of going up to Isaiah 39. And it's all about Hezekiah. Unlike so many of the kings of Judah, Hezekiah generally was a good king, he was a godly king, but he had a number of big problems. First of all, he had massive problem of a threat from the superpower of the day, which was Assyria. And he gets out of that problem neatly. He buys himself some time. He gives silver and gold to King Sennacherib, and that problem is at least put on the back burner. And then when Assyria actually invade, his prayers are answered because that army is then depleted by God sending a plague upon them. Then later on we read about a second serious problem that Hezekiah had in terms of a serious personal illness. He's likely to die, but he pleads to God for extra time, and God delivers him and promises him an extra 15 years of life. Then he had a relatively small problem in terms of contact from Babylonia. The Babylonians were not yet a superpower, and we read in chapter 39 that he foolishly reveals the extent of the treasures of Judah to certain envoys from Babylon. And then his troubles really begun after that foolishness. Later on, Babylon would become a superpower themselves. Hezekiah selfishly wasn't too worried about that because he felt that probably he'd get through the 15 years extra that he had been given. So by the time we get to Isaiah 40, God's people have been carted off to exile, many of them, very discouraged. Basically this chapter was written to people who'd been running on one track where they were full of hope for the future, and now they were stranded on a new track where they had lost all those hopes. And the message comes at the beginning of Isaiah chapter 40, comfort my people, comfort my people. So message to the prophet Isaiah to pass on to the people of Judah was that God wanted to comfort them. A difficult message to bring because they were not a people who were feeling particularly comforted at that time. And what do you say to people when they're struggling with the circumstances, where there seems no solution to a paralysing long-term problem? It resonates a little bit with where we are at the moment with the coronavirus. What do you say to a people who have lost hope? Well, what the prophet says to the people of Judah is this, very important. 4 words: God is in control. God is in control. He prophesies that the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all people will see it together. God is in control. His glory will be revealed and everyone will see it. He says God is sovereign. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. God is sovereign. That's the message of Isaiah chapter 40 and the chapters after that. God is sovereign. God is in control. And an important principle arising from these chapters and from Isaiah 40 is that God's people need to believe that God is just as much in control in their disasters as he is in their deliverances. Now today we're filming in Combe Abbey Country Park. 5 years ago I was here at this very spot playing games, frisbee, rounders, cricket, and I actually had a heart attack and ended up in hospital and had a very risky quintuple bypass where the doctors didn't want to do it, a high risk of infection, but the risk of not doing it was greater than the risk of doing it. And I was sidelined from Christian ministry for a number of months. At that time I learned that even in a personal disaster like that God was in control, and he proved it to me the way that he delivered me. God was in control. He's just as much in control with our disasters as he is when we are being delivered. And the second thing that arises from Isaiah 40 is that God will fulfill his purposes. God's main purpose in the Old Testament starts with the single character Abraham, who was the father of the Jews, almost the founder of the Israelites. Arising from Abraham eventually were 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes were reduced to 2 tribes, the southern tribes of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel virtually disappeared once they went into exile. 12 tribes have become 2. The 2 tribes go into exile in Babylon, facing possible annihilation. What had happened to God's purposes for his people? Things going downhill. But the message of the prophet Isaiah here in Isaiah 40 is this: every one of God's purposes will be fulfilled. Every one of his purposes will be fulfilled. We read in Isaiah 40 that God reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. God reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. So, was Isaiah right to bring a message of hope in Isaiah chapter 40? Well, he was. And we read these words: make straight a highway for our God. Make straight a highway for our God. And actually that had a double fulfillment, because God's people eventually did come home from exile under the godly leadership of men like Ezra and Nehemiah. And the second fulfillment, much later on, make it straight a highway for our God, referred to the coming Messiah. And of course, God's Messiah would come in the person of Jesus. In a few weeks, we'll be celebrating that. So Israel was able to bring a message to people who were demoralized, who had lost hope. God is in control. God will fulfill his purposes. And let me tell you today that that is true for us. Whatever happens in the next few months as we hope for a vaccine, whatever happens, God is in control. God will fulfill his purposes. Believe that. God bless you.
Greater things have yet to come.